Are you a master of your domain? Hello, everyone. Bront CatHerder here. Appreciate y'all hanging by, stopping by for the video, and we're having some fun talking Raid Shadow Legends. So today we're in the Minotaur's Labyrinth because we're going to be talking about Masteries, which I know is not going to be the sexiest of topics or the most interesting of topics. In fact, I'm sure it's going to be quite dry, but hopefully I can keep you guys a little entertained and talk to you about how important Masteries are. I find as somebody who does a lot of takeovers on Twitch, you can check me at the Twitch link down below. I get a lot of people who have either just copied masteries without checking to see which masteries they should be using on champions, or have had masteries that have caused problems with builds that I have been trying to make, or sometimes a matter of not simply having masteries when masteries would either make a build possible that was not possible beforehand, or make a build better than it was before, shrinking runs down, cutting off a few minutes off of a runs. There's all kinds of things masteries can do. Masteries on a nuker can increase your nuker's damage by 20% or more. Masteries on a defensive champion can reduce the damage that they take significantly, can give you a better chance to stun targets, and a 5% better chance to stun on every hit is amazing when you're attacking 5 champions. It's amazing how much difference it feels. Getting a better chance to land debuffs, having increased accuracy, getting additional turn meter. There are so many things that masteries do to make your champions better. Does every champion need masteries? No. Champions you're just going to be using for single content, like if you're using it for a Centrino's floor, you probably don't need masteries. If you're going to be using it for faction wars, it can depend on the champions. Sometimes they don't even need full masteries. You can get all the low level masteries pretty cheaply. But masteries are definitely worth looking at. Overall, we're going to look at the mastery trees. But first, I need to talk about my sponsor, you guys. You guys are what keep me going. I love making these videos, and I love them because I love the response I'm getting from you. So if you have not had a chance to do it, please smash that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. Get a chance to like the videos if you like the videos. Leave comments if you get a chance. It really helps the YouTube algorithm, and it helps encourage me to make more videos, which I think is more important than the YouTube algorithm. I love making videos. I love if I'm influenced in it, help you guys have more fun in Raid, learn a little bit about the game. And I just want to get my channel to grow and to reach more people to help more people. So if you could do that, I would greatly appreciate it. So let's go take a look at one of the best tools as far as getting masteries, and we'll talk about the masteries themselves. All right, so we are here at Raidbro. Raidbro is a raid tools website. To be fair, I don't use Raidbro for much else other than this mastery tool, but this mastery tool is absolutely amazing. This mastery tool allows me to build masteries fairly quickly and look and see how much they cost. I can experiment with trees, make sure I get all the masteries I'm looking for. Now that I'm done with it, I can actually click down here, click on this link, and I now have a copy of these that I can then send to somebody else. So these are great for building masteries for people that don't have the masteries yet. These are something I can actually use, and I probably should start using for dropping links to masteries for champions that I build for videos. It's very good for sharing masteries, overall going over the masteries, how much they cost. Nice and easy. You can clear it really easily. And it also has all the descriptions, which are the same descriptions you'll have in game. So this was a good tool for me to show. There are other tools that do this as well. If you guys have any other tools that are actually really good, like Raidbro for this type of thing, feel free to link them in the comments and I'll go double check them and confirm them. They are very, very good tools, very helpful for planning your champions and can save you some gems. Because one of the things about masteries is masteries can cost gems to rebuild. So it's free. You get one reset for free. And then every reset after where that is an additional 150 gems. Now, 150 gems may not sound a lot to a lot of people, but that's nearly 4 refills, which means that's less energy for champ training. That's less energy for running Minotaur to get some of these as well. There's a lot of things you can certainly do with 150 gems. It's a better use of your gems than resetting your masteries regularly. So knowing what masteries are best for you and planning them out can save you gems. It can definitely save you some time. It can feel like a step that's a little extra if you're getting the hang of the masteries, but I even find myself occasionally clicking on the wrong mastery out of habit, and it's frustrating. I recommend using a tool like Raidbro when you're doing your masteries. It's a wonderful, wonderful tool for figuring these out. So we're going to start tree by tree, and we're going to start with the offense tree. The offense tree is going to be used on all your arena nukers, and honestly, it will end up being used on most of your PvE champions, because most of your PvE champions can use the extra damage to speed up your runs. Not entirely true. There's a couple of champions that will probably end up in the defense and support trees, but generally, offense and support or offense and defense are the two trees that most champions end up in. So offense starts off with your attack plus 75 or your crit rate plus 5. Either one of these can be good, especially on a nuker that you're looking to build attack on. Attack plus 75 can be very good. For a non-attack nuker, there's no reason to ever get this ability. But overall, I find that the extra 5% crit rate just makes builds easier, and it's not worth redoing the masteries to get that extra attack, whereas quite often I will find I'm 5 crit rate short on a build, or being able to be 5 crit rate short on a build and then using the masteries to get to that extra 5 crit rate to get you to 100% crit rate can make you get additional crit damage or additional speed. It's basically one pip somewhere in your upgrades that doesn't need to be in crit rate. That can be in some other more useful stat for your build. Now, one of the only exceptions you're going to find to whether or not you want to go attack versus crit rate is for bomb champions. Bomb champions are going to want to have attack because their bombs are powered off of attack, not crit. So bomb champions, I guess if there's any other particular champions, would have attack-powered abilities that are not just straight attack. Maybe you're going to want to attack on them. But in general, crit rate is going to be your go-to in the lower tier. Overall, the value of it, I think, is just not as good as having the crit rate, and the value of not having to worry about resetting them makes some sense. That said, if you're min-maxing to an extreme, which in an arena nuker you might be, you might want to build the champion out first, understand you don't have the masteries set up yet, and figure out which one you want to pick before you actually pick one. But in general, I'll pick the 5% crit rate. The other reason you might want to, but probably aren't going to, is that with all of these here, we'll pick the 5% crit rate. With all of these here, if I pick this one, I can only get one of the 3 that are near it. I can't get over to this far one over here. So in some builds, that's big enough where you cannot get to this far one here and this far one here at the same time. So sometimes the tier 2 mastery may change which tier 1 you're going to pick. In the case of offense, that's rarely, if ever, going to be the case. And the reason why is the crit rate is here. This one is your crit damage one. This is the one that you're going to pick on almost every champion that goes the offense tree, because generally you're looking for crit rate and crit damage. So now that we established that you're looking for the crit rate and the crit damage, what do the other ones do? Well, this one over here, Heart of Glory, increases the damage you inflict by 5% when attacking with full HP. This one over here, Shield Breaker, inflicts 25% additional damage when somebody's under a shield buff. However, there appears to be an asterisk by that one. According to Saf from HH Gaming, this only affects damage done to shields. While that's still a good thing in places like the arena, that is not something you're going to find particularly useful in a lot of other cases, and the fact that it doesn't actually do damage to the actual champion, it only does additional damage to the shields, makes this a little less useful outside of some of those arena nuker scenarios. And then finally, inflicting 5% additional damage when you're under 50%. Grim Resolve and Heart of Glory are good for if you know you're either going to be mostly full or full. So in a block damage team against Clan Boss, for example, Heart of Glory is great against a lot of other PvE where you're usually going first and no one's going to get a chance to attack you. That's great. If you're, on the other hand, doing a lot of solo content where you could be damaged quite a bit and have a good chance of being under 50%, this is actually a very good one to grab as well. If neither of these really fit anything you really want to do, well, you can grab 2 in the support or the defense tree as well. So you don't necessarily have to grab one of these as well, but it may also depend on what else you're looking for over here. Now, keep in mind, you go for these 2, for example, you've got these 3 things easily accessible, but if you want to get this one over here, Ruthless Ambush, which is a good one for a lot of champions, we'll get into it, you then have to go over and grab this as well. So the reality of this web tree is sometimes you're going to grab a couple of them you don't necessarily care about. Overall, you're definitely going to grab Keen Strike, and just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to grab Shield Breaker just so that we've got something here and I've got access to all four of them. Now, as far as the offense tree goes, onto the third tier, you've got Single Out, which is increased damage inflicted to targets with less than 40% HP by 8%. This can be very good against bosses. It's definitely very good when you're trying to clean up in arena, because oftentimes you get somebody low and you want to be able to finish them off. And 8% damage, again, is nothing to sneeze at. Life Drinker is very good in PvE. It basically means you heal some of the damage you inflict when you're under 50% HP. This is good, particularly with some of the other damage dealing abilities you have here. So this can be a very good thing to keep your champions alive in PvE content, add a little more tank ability to them. Whirlwind of Death basically gives you additional speed, 6 speed up to 18 for every champion you kill. Can be very good in arena for speeding you up when you do more damage and do more kills. Can be very good for speeding up champions when they're going through PvE, so that eventually, especially for solo champions, 18 free speed effectively for a champion that's going to be soloing through all of the content. That's pretty decent amount of boost. Finally, Ruthless Ambush is the increased damage inflicted by the first hit on each enemy by 8%. Keep in mind, this is the first hit on each enemy. So if you do a single target on one enemy, the next enemy you attack, if they're a different enemy, will get that 8%. This is very good for like your Seer nuker abilities. This is very good for an AoE nuker in arena that you expect to clean up everybody in one hit, or clean up as much as they can in one hit. It's a very powerful ability. It is also a very weak ability because it only works against the first hit. And if you're in a fight like Hydra, Ruthless Ambush is going to be wasted because Hydra takes so long. You're only going to ever get this once per head. So it's worth considering, but it's not going to be the end all be all. However, 8% is a pretty big buff. Bring it down. Increased damage inflicted by 6% when attacking targets with higher max HP. This is great against bosses because all bosses are going to have higher max HP. This is great for arena nukers that are not your HP nuker champions, because almost every support champion is going to have a higher max HP as well. Very useful overall, even in PvE against the waves. The waves have so much base HP. This is a no-brainer for your PvE builds. Wrath of the Slain increases the damage inflicted by 5% for each dead ally. Stacks up to 10%. This can be useful for your solo champions that everyone else is going to die in the team by design anyway. This can be useful in arena because people may die in arena, so it's just extra damage. It helps you come back from when you're struggling in arena. Overall, it's a pretty solid one to take. It really will depend on the team whether or not it's going to be extremely useful, but it's not a bad one to take for most champions. Cycle of Violence. 30% chance of decreasing the cooldown of one random skill by one turn if you inflict more than 30% of a target's max HP. This is good for like your Seer wave nuking. This is good for your AoE damage nukers in arena because they can get resets on some of their skills. And you get enough resets stacked, you can often do a skill that's a one shot, one kill twice, especially if you're getting extra turns. It's actually pretty gross. Cycle Violence is great on a lot of your arena nukers. In PvE, it's more limited, but it's still a very good ability. Finally, the Opportunist. 12% damage when somebody is stunned, sleeped, or frozen. This can be useful in teams where you have a lot of freeze or a lot of stun, because this is 12% additional damage. It can be very good on nukers that have control in the waves as well. It can be very good against some of the Fire Knight teams where you're using a lot of freeze for hard Fire Knight and you're freezing the waves. Well, now that I've got Opportunist, the 20% freeze damage reduction is mostly mitigated by the 12% damage increase. Not entirely, but it helps a little bit there. Good overall, but certainly a little more circumstantial than some of these other ones here. We have Methodical. Methodical increases the damage inflicted by a champion's default skill by 2% each time is used during battle. This can be great, especially in long battles, because 10% more damage on an A1 is still 10% more damage. And if you're using, heavy attack champions, you've got your Trundas, you've got your Harimas, champions that hit really hard. Candies are actually a good example. He hits really hard with his A1. 10% extra damage on one of the hardest hitting A1s in the game is 10% more damage on one of the hardest hitting A1s in the game. So if you're in arena It's a little questionable because sometimes you never use the A1 in Arena, or at least you hope to never use the A1. But if you do, the extra damage can be great. If you're talking about a long, protracted battle, you're going to get to that 10% pretty quickly. Clan Boss, this is almost required for most of your champions. It adds a lot of extra damage. 10% on half of the times your champion's going to attack is 10% extra damage. That's hard to argue with. You've got Kill Streak, which is basically an additional 6% in Arena, 3% in other locations, stacks up to 12% for each champion you kill. Very good for your arena nukers, can be very good for your wave-based nukers as well. Not as good in things like Hydra, definitely not super useful in Clan Boss. It's one that ends up getting taken a lot anyway because it's one of the gateways into some of the higher tier stuff. Really good for waves, really good for arena, not great against boss-only encounters. Blood Shield places a shield when you kill an enemy. The shield is 50% of this champion's max HP. So this is a good skill for your HP nukers and your defense nukers that are going to have a lot more X HP than, say, your attack nukers, especially the ones that are designed to be super squishy. It's still marginal. The shield is okay. It adds a little bit of survivability, but generally you're looking for more damage over other stuff. So I would definitely take Methodical over this. I would probably take Kill Streak over this. And if Kill Streak's not going to matter because you're not killing anything, neither is Blood Shield. So you're already out with that. Finally, Stoked Fury. Increase the damage inflicted by 4% for each debuff on this champion. Stacks up to 12%. Generally, you don't want to be taking debuffs, but in Arena, sometimes you're going to be forced to take them anyway. So this can be helpful for an Arena champion sometimes. It really depends on the team. It probably depends on whether or not you have block debuffs as well on the team. If you're sheeping people, you're not going to have a lot of debuffs. In Arena, debuffs are not as big a deal as they used to be. In PvE content, yes, sometimes you get the debuffs, but most of the debuffs tend to be control debuffs now. So there's not a lot of times when you have a debuff on you that's not going to prevent you from attacking in the first place in PvE content that's really going to allow this to shine. Doesn't mean it's not a bad mastery. It is 12% if you have 3 debuffs on this champion. And it can mitigate things like decrease attack a little bit, for example. But overall, I don't like Stoked Fury as much as some of the other ones. It really does depend on what you're going for. And then finally, we get the Tier 6 Masteries. And the Tier 6 Masteries, you can only have one Tier 6 Mastery across all of these. So you want to pick these carefully. And sometimes you want to pick which one you're going for first before you go down a tree. Because you'll see here, I went down the center and the way I've got this built, which is not a realistic build. But now I've got access to all 4 of these. But if I went over here, I wouldn't have access to Flawless Execution, for example. And if I wanted Flawless Execution, that's a problem. So I might have to get Blood Shield, for example, rather than Kill Streak, just because I want to get Flawless Execution. And that's always something you want to think about. Now, I'm using Flawless Execution as an example here. I'm not saying Flawless Execution is worth doing that for necessarily. We'll get into that in a minute. So War Master is pretty much the tried and true PvE extra damage. 60% chance of inflicting a 10% champion max HP hit or a 4% boss max HP hit. Now, Clan Boss, it's coded to be a very specific set of damage. For everybody else, it's the 4%. It's good. The 60% chance of inflicting it means it's very reliable. It's not obviously 100%, but it means when you've got 5 hits, 3 of them are going to get this bonus damage. This bonus damage triggers some of the masteries such as Life Drinker. It works with Lifesteal gear. It can count as an extra hit in some cases where the hits count for stuff. Overall, it's a very, very good ability. It's a lot of extra damage, especially for solo champions that are not getting another mastery because they need it for their specific build. It can be a very good one because it can add a lot of damage. For example, a Lady Annabelle Bommel, which I've made a video on earlier, mastery like War Master will help you speed up the run significantly because War Master will do more damage than her A1 does at any point in time. So, and that's in addition to the damage your A1 does. Helm Smasher is your quintessential arena nuker because ignoring defense is huge. It can add a ton of damage. Now, you've only got a 50% chance of ignoring defense, but for arena, that's huge. For things like your Sand Devil, your Shogun, some of the hard dungeons, ignoring that defense can add quite a bit of damage. How much damage it adds and whether or not it's worth more than War Master is somewhat debatable. Honestly, I think War Master is better against most PvE content that's not waves. Against the waves, Helm Smasher is absolutely great because it means that the waves that you might not have killed, you suddenly ignore a bunch of defense and suddenly you just nuke it to morbid. Very, very useful overall. It really will also depend on what kind of gear you've got. The more defense you're already ignoring, the more Helm Smasher can become more reliable and more needed. So, for example, a Georgian who ignores 50% defense already on a 50% chance. The Helm Smasher can make that a 75% chance, or can give you 25% chance when that 50% ignore 50 doesn't proc. Plus, then you've got Savage on them, for example, to ignore another 25%. You've got a chance of ignoring 100% defense with a Georgid with Helm Smasher. And if you have something else on there, it might be 105, which, you can't really go over 105, but it means if you miss on something, you've still got that extra 5% here or there. So that's where Helm Smasher comes in. That's why Helm Smasher is more of a PvP one, but honestly, it can be very good against wave killers as well. Giant Slayer is a 30% chance of inflicting bonus damage when attacking. It is a per hit, not a per attack like War Master. However, you'll notice it only does 7.5% of the champion's max HP or 3% of the target's maximum HP when attacking bosses. That means that Giant Slayer against most champions doesn't do as much damage as War Master does unless it procs multiple times, and the chance of it proccing multiple times relies on you having at least 3 hits, if not 4 or more, in the attack. The exception for that is Clan Boss. In Clan Boss, it does the same amount of damage no matter what, which means if you have more triple hit attacks, Giant Slayer can be better than War Master, and on average, it's pretty decent. It keeps up on the damage. For other content outside of Clan Boss, you need a champion that is regularly hitting at least 3 times minimum and probably hitting 4 times on a few of their abilities before Giant Slayer becomes worth looking at over War Master. There's a lot of math to bear that out. I don't have access to it because I did not want to draw up all the statistics on it. Overall, it takes about 3.5 hits to really get back what you want to get with Giant Slayer on average. It really can depend on the champion and what the use case scenario for it is. It does, however, mean that there could be wilder swings. So if you don't mind gambling a little bit with Giant Slayer, you can get more damage out of Giant Slayer than you can out of War Master. But again, War Master is going to be more consistent because it's going to hit more often. It only requires the single hit. So especially if you're hitting at random and you're not hitting the same champion multiple times, you'll get War Master procs on different champions then. Overall, I like War Master better for most scenarios. 2 notable scenarios where Giant Slayer is better. Brogni has a damage ability on his shield where he reflects damage back. Giant Slayer around can proc multiple times on that, whereas War Master will only proc once on the single counter attack. So if he does reflecting damage and does 25 hits of reflecting damage to the enemy, there's 25 chances for Giant Slayer to proc. That makes Giant Slayer a lot better than 1 proc of War Master. Another one is Shamael, who, when in Hydra, he can counterattack, and sometimes he's counterattacking 18 times because all 6 of your champions got 3 poisons on him. He will proc Giant Slayer every time he counterattacks, or have a chance to, I should say. So he's got 18 chances of 30% to proc Giant Slayer, making Giant Slayer much more valuable than War Master on a champion like Shamael. That's also where Geo's reflect damage is actually based off of Giant Slayer and not War Master. In fact, Polarium took advice when they made the change to Geo for that. So do keep that in mind. But for the most part, I recommend War Master or Helm Smasher for these two over Giant Slayer. And then our final one, Flawless Execution. Flawless Execution used to be very useful for the max HP hitters because 20% flat crit damage is nice. It's still useful for the wave clear seers in some cases because while Helm Smasher can be nice, you want reliability on a wave clear, not a random chance of it being amazing. So 20% extra crit damage, nothing to sneeze at. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it can be very, very helpful. Over dungeon level 20, you cap out at 10% of the boss's health per max HP hit, which makes that much less useful, and you're better off with something like a War Master, which can do damage outside of the max HP hit, or a Giant Slayer, depending on how many hits you're talking about again. Or if you're struggling to get to that, Helm Smasher can be helpful because Helm Smasher can ignore a lot of defense, which can suddenly push the damage up quite a bit as well. So Flawless Execution doesn't have a lot of use cases, but it does have a few, particularly earlier on. Now, it does mean you might eventually rebuild some champions, but your Cold Hearts early on could use Flawless Execution. It can help get you that extra 20% crit damage. It can actually be helpful for your campaign farmers. Campaign farmers, you want to be consistent. Flawless Execution has one thing going for it. It is consistent. There's no chance of it happening. It is simply flat bonus damage. So from that perspective, it's great. And that covers the offense tree. Generally, if I go offense tree for most champions, the most commonly picked paths that I have are going to be this one right here is what I will base most of my stuff on. You get the 5% crit rate, you get the 10% crit damage. I like having Life Drinker on most PvE builds. If it's not a PvE build, I might go to Single Out instead. Then I'll bring it down, grab Methodical, and grab War Master. And again, if it's not going to be a PvE build, I might go Helm Smasher depending on the champion. I might still go War Master, or I might take another tier 6 in a different area if I'm looking for that. But overall, these are the ones I find I take the most. Again, Ruthless Ambush can be great for your arena nukers. So can Cycle of Violence. There's a bunch of use cases for some of these things, but hopefully understanding what they do can give you a better idea of which ones you should pick for your champions. So let's go take a look at the defense tree. All right, so the tier 1s in the defense tree start off pretty simple. You've got plus 75 defense and plus 10 resistance. Plus 10 resistance doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're building resistance, every little bit of resistance helps. 75 defense at the same time doesn't sound like a lot. And honestly, what I find is I will start with one or the other based off of what I want to go into the tier 2. And we'll go into that. The tier 2, we've got Blast Proof, AoE damage reduced by 5%. This can be good in Arena if you're dealing with AoE nukers, but overall there's a better one for the Arena. This is great for against Hydra, against any of the PvE stuff where you're mostly getting attacked with AoE attacks. So this is 5% damage reduction against AoEs. Very, very helpful, very, very useful. So if I'm going PvE, I'm most likely going to take Tough Skin and then take Blast Proof. Right next to it, we've got Rejuvenation, which increases the value of healing and value of shield buffs this champion receives by 5%. This can be very good for solo champions because it's an additional 5% healing and additional 5% shield as that may be. 5% extra of whatever you're getting can be very huge if you're healing 20 to 30% of your max HP per turn based off of some of the solo strategies out there. Overall, it's just very good for making your champion kind of tanky. It's a good one to take overall. Mighty Endurance, I don't take this one that often because I don't plan on building teams where I'm going to get stunned, sleeped, or frozen very often. That said, it could have some use in certain champions if that's actually a reasonable strategy. If you have, for example, a White Queen, she can sometimes take the stuns, sleeps, or freezes from other champions and put them on herself. And if she's not automatically clearing them because you know the White King with him, then this could be very useful because this means that she's taking 10% less damage while she has one of these things on her, and she's stealing it from other allies and taking it for them instead. So from that perspective, she can be very, very helpful. That's probably one of the few cases that it makes some sense to go with this. Otherwise, I generally find that if I'm taking a second defense, I'm probably taking Rejuvenation with one of the two edge case ones. Improved Parry is 8% damage decrease when this champion is critically hit. This is why this is a better one for PvP than PvE. In PvE, you're generally not getting critical hit. I think there's actually only one boss, and that's the Shogun, that really has a good chance of critically hitting you. And if you're not fighting him, then you're 15% chance, possibly less, depending on affinity issues, to get critical hit at any point in time. So not a major concern. Whereas in Arena, the Arena nukers are generally built to critical hit. So 8% less damage with a critical hit It's amazing, well worth grabbing. Shadow Heal. Heals his champion by 6% of their max HP each time an enemy is healed, occurs once per turn. This is great in Arena. This can be great for solo builds as well when you know your enemy is going to be healing. It's not the best out there, but 6% heal once per turn effectively is a nice little perk if you're against enemies that are healing. Resurgent, 50% chance to remove one random debuff with this chance when they lose 25% of their max HP or more than a single enemy equal skill. This is very critical to know when you're dealing with Arena. This is why in Arena, if you nuke somebody and don't kill them and they're stunned and suddenly they cease being stunned when you hit them and you didn't kill them with a nuke. This is particularly what is doing it. This can be very good in Arena. This can be helpful in PvE as well if you're fighting some of the ones that can nuke really hard, like you're doing an Ice Golem run. Resurgent could actually help you in the Ice Golem run, but that's assuming you survive in the first place. Very good in PvE because it gives you a chance to occasionally cleanse a control debuff. Not as good in PvE, but not the worst thing in the world. Bloodthirst heals the enemy by 10% when they kill an enemy target. I think it's supposed to be this champion, not this enemy, and I think that's what it says in Raid. So that might be a Raidbro issue. Regardless, if you kill a target, you get a 10% max HP heal, 1 per turn. Not bad for nukers. Pretty common. In fact, oftentimes when I'm taking a AoE or an AoE, but a PvP champion, I might do this and then grab this one as the second one up here. Finally, Wisdom of Battle, 30% chance of placing a block debuff on this champion for 1 turn when a stun, sleep, or freeze debuff expires on this champion. This can also be good. White Queen is actually really good for this. This isn't good in general for avoiding control or making sure that if you are being controlled that you have an out afterwards, that you don't immediately get re-controlled afterwards. But this is a PvP focused much more than it is a PvE focus. There's a couple of examples I can think of, possibly like the dragon, where this might be okay. But overall, you're going to want to use this in PvP, and that's the only place you're going to find a lot of use for that. And that's really the case with a lot of the defense tree. The defense tree actually leans more into PvP than PvE, but that's fine. In Tier 4, we've got Solidarity, increase ally resist by 5 for each buff placed on them by this champion. That includes the champion that's casting this. So if you have a high resist champion that you want additional resist and they put a lot of buffs out there, Solidarity is not a bad option for you. It's probably not the best, but it's not too bad. Delay Death reduces damage this champion receives by less than 1%, but it can reduce up to 6% every time they take a hit from an enemy. This is great in long battles. This can be good for the clan boss, for example. Against the clan boss is going to hit you enough to get to that 6%. And by the time he gets to that 6%, he's going to start doing more and more and more damage. So the initial isn't great, but in prolonged fights, Delay Death can be very great. So it's usually one of the few I almost always take if I'm in the defense tree. Not always, but usually. Harvest Despair. This is great for some of your control champions. It throws a leech out there if somebody throws a stun, sleep, or freeze. And so this is good. Oftentimes, like if I have a Kymar, I'll throw this on my Kymar just because. Miscreated Monster. This could be very good for a Miscreated Monster. If you're building somebody in Stun Set and you know you're building them in Sunset, 60% chance to get a leech out. Doesn't suck. It's only a 1 turn, so it doesn't come at a huge play, but it's a bonus debuff, which can be useful for all kinds of things. And Leech helps your champions heal. So Leech is a pretty good develop. So this can be a very, very useful, but you really do need to know the champion, how you're going to build them for this to be useful. Finally, Stubbornness, increases resistance by 10 for each debuff on this champion, stacks up to 30. This is a weird one because it literally says, if I get debuffed, I want to be less likely to get debuffed next time. It's okay, but the use case for this is really kind of weird. This is basically if for some reason somebody gets lucky and gets a debuff and I don't want them to have a chance to get lucky next time. That's really kind of what that's for. Selfless Defender. This can be very good in protecting champions. Decrease the damage an ally receives from the first enemy hit in each round by 20%. This champion will receive that damage instead. So if you have a champion that's regenerating, has huge shields to start off with, or is some other way able to take damage, Krisk is a good example, Volgoth can be a good example, but you're tanking your champions if you want them to be taking a little more damage. This is a good way to alleviate a little bit of damage here or there. It can be useful in PvP, where you can protect a couple of champions that might be squishy otherwise, with a 20% of that damage going to somebody else. Good on an Asurga. It can also be good in some of the solo stuff, where maybe you don't want the solo champion to die, so somebody else runs with this so that they die first instead. There's a couple uses for it. It's not going to get major use, but it's a decent one. Cycle of Revenge. This is a team comp killer if you're not careful. 50% chance of increasing the turn meter by 15% when an ally is attacked with a critical hit. Will only increase the turn meter once if the ally receives multiple critical hits from a single skill. What this can do is if you get critical hit in a tuned team where the turn meter is tuned and has to go to a specific order, if you take that extra hit and you happen to take a random critical hit, which in a long fight like Clan Boss can happen, or in something like Shogun, it's got a 50% chance of happening, so it happens fairly often, the bonus turn meter will throw off your team. So you have to be careful that you're not using this with a perfectly speed-tuned team and have Cycle of Revenge. This is one of the ones that can kill a perfectly tuned team. But if you're not in a perfectly tuned team, this is a great skill. I like extra turn meter. I want to go faster. I want to go first, and it's an ally. So it means that, for example, Duchess, who puts up the veils so only she can be attacked, or UDK, who can take the first hits, UDK gets critically hit, soaks the damage, and your nuker gets faster. I don't see what's not to like about that. Retribution has a 50% chance to counterattack when this champion loses 25% of their max HP or more from a single skill. This is a possible free counterattack, but at the same time, you need to survive that 25% or more max HP hit for this to even come into play in the first place. So this is good for maybe HP nukers, might be actually find this one particularly useful. You some of your tankier champions that have good A1s that do something interesting might be useful, like an Ancora who could cooldowns off on her A1. Any useful A1 Retribution can be good. So overall, this can be a very good one. Rhodos is actually really good with Retribution because Rhodos gets hit with this. Rhodos can't take more than 50% of his max HP, but when he takes the 50%, he'll then have a 50% chance of counterattacking, and then he'll just take another turn because the way his passive works anyway. So if you see Rhodos getting hit and then taking 2 turns in a row, it's not necessarily because he triggered a counterattack. He might have Retribution. And then finally, we get Deterrence. 20% chance to counterattack when an enemy applies stun, sleep, or freeze debuff. And these stun, sleeps, or freeze are for any of the control debuffs. I don't think this has been updated. So fears work for this as well. Deterrence is great in the Hydra because deterrence can cause counterattacks when your champions get feared. You do have to be careful with it because what can happen is a champion that was not feared does a counterattack and gets feared by the fearhead, so that's a problem. This is also good in Arena, where control debuffs can be problematic. So if somebody controls my Reviver and my nuker happens to have deterrence, my nuker goes over and smacks the person who controlled my Reviver. You know, I might win because of that. So deterrence is a good one as well. Oftentimes you see people take these two together if they can't take Cycle of Revenge. I really like Cycle of Revenge if I go the defense tree and take it when I can, but sometimes deterrence is just too hard to not take. Deterrence is also great for clan boss runs where you have a stun target that actually gets stunned, because that means everybody else might attack with deterrence. Finally, again, we can only take one of these things, so you got to be picky with these. Iron Skin plus 200 defense, probably the weakest of them. 200 defense is nice. I think I'd rather have more HP, which is in the support tree, or some of the other abilities here, or do more damage. Bulwark. Decrease the damage all allies receive by 5%. This champion will receive them the damage instead. This is, again, great for champions. I've seen Bulwark taken on champions that you don't want to be slept because Bulwark will wake them up from sleep. So that's good. I've seen it taken on champions that are in Stone Skin, so you just reduce everyone else's damage a little bit while the Stone Skin soaks up the Bulwark. They're good for some of your Usurgas that were already soaking up a little bit of damage. Have them soak just a little bit more. Kyokus who put a block damage on themselves. They'll absorb the damage and they won't actually take it. There's all kinds of good uses for Bulwark. That said, if you have multiple champions with Bulwark, only one of them works. So you do have to be careful about building a team when you're going to be using Bulwark. Fearsome Presence, one of the more common ones that it gets taken out of the defense tree. It's an additional 5% for skills or artifacts to place your stuns, sleeps, freezes, provokes, those type of skills. This turns a 18% stun set into a 23% stun set, and do not underestimate that 5% extra on a stun set. That is amazing. That can make a huge difference, and that can turn a run from very, very bad RNG to, oh, good, I'm usually getting at least one, if not two stuns every time I attack AoE with this champion. And that's a big, big difference. Finally, Unshakable is another one that gets taken an awful lot, plus 50 resistance. Plus 50 resistance is pretty huge. That's more than most set bonuses ever come out to. And if you're building a high resistance champion, which you're probably building for PvE or PvP, although you never know, you've already gone down some of this edge here to get this plus 10 resistance most likely, and you're going to grab this plus 50 resistance right here. And that's great. That's a good use for it. Just looking at defense before we look at the support tree, generally I tend to do something like this in the support defense tree. Whether or not I take this ability or this ability will depend on where I'm at. Sometimes because I can't take this and this, I go like this. And again, oftentimes you end up with these two here in the defense tree, just because you want the retribution and you want the deterrence, particularly for things like Clan Boss. And if you don't want Cycle of Revenge, then obviously you cannot take Cycle of Revenge. That's bad. That's another reason I often don't end up with Iron Skin, is I end up over here an awful lot. So that's worth noting. It's also worth noting with Fearsome Presence. If you're going to take Fearsome Presence, you're going to need to take one of these three to be able to get to Fearsome Presence. So it's worth looking at what you want to go for when you're going down this tree. So finally, that brings us to the support tree. The support tree is one of the more common ones you use because so many champions we use actually use debuffs. Support tree has a plus 10 accuracy, which can be huge. It also has a plus 810 max HP. Which one you're going to go for will really depend. Are you doing a tanky champion that needs the extra HP? Are you doing a champion that doesn't have debuffs? Then you're more likely to go down the support tree. The other reason to go down this support tree with Steadfast is Steadfast counts as a defensive buff, such as increased defense in Clan Boss. So if you're building a Clan Boss team and you want to control the stun target actually does look at how many buffs do I have on each champion. And Stalwart counts as an increased defense buff. It actually stacks with increased defense as far as that's concerned, which means that if it's choosing between two different targets, they will choose the one that does not have Steadfast versus the one that does have Steadfast, with all other things being equal. So that is one of the reasons that you may actually take Steadfast in some champions. It's worth considering. It's worth looking into. So if we go down the Steadfast line, then we're probably mostly going to be sticking on this side here. This has increased the value of heals this champion casts by 5%. This does work with sets, so regeneration will also get affected by this as well. This affects other champions, so your Soul of the Drakes, this can be very useful for the Soul of the Drakes, can be very useful for your Rector Draths. There's a lot of champions that can gain a lot from the Lay on Hands ability here. Shield Bearer gives you a increased value of shields cast by 5%, very similar to the healing. So if you have a shield champion, you're going to go on the Shield Bearer here. Exalted in Death heals this champion by 10% the first time an enemy is killed each round. This is great because it does not require you to kill the champion. So for champions that are a little squishier than you'd like, or champions you absolutely want to make sure they live, putting Exalt in Death could be very helpful to keep them alive by giving them a free 10% heal the first time somebody's killed in a round. And then finally, if we're going on the accuracy, Charge Focus is increased accuracy by 20 when this champion has no skills on cooldown. So this means the first skill that you're casting, usually a debuff if this is what you're taking, although to be fair, you might just take this regardless, is got an additional 20 accuracy. This won't show up on your stats, but you can keep in the back of the mind knowing that you're going to actually still have this 20 accuracy when you cast your decreased defense, for example, for a champion that's supposed to be bringing decreased defense, as long as no other skills are on cooldown. So you probably don't want to count on this always being available, but depending on the team you're building, you might be able to count on it on being mostly available. And if you're talking about the first round being the most important, or you have skill resets that you're going to be using, this is more likely to be available, can be very helpful. Go back to the healing side. Increase the amount of healing and value of shield buffs. So this is healing and shields by 10% of the if they're at 40% HP or less. So this is basically if they're hurt worse, they get a better shield and or healing. This is actually really good for champions that do both shielding and healing. Brogni, for example, heals when people hit the shield, so he puts up a bigger shield and then heals based off the damage hit by the shield. So the healing savior can be very good for a Brogni, for example. Rapid response, 30% chance of increasing the turn meter by 10% when a buff cast by this champion is removed or expired. This is turn meter boost for buffers. Very useful, very bad for clan boss because you don't want a tuned team to have a random chance of having a turn meter buff. So do keep that in mind. This is one of the clan boss killer ones that you can do. Quite often, champions end up taking Healing Savior or taking Swarm Smiter, even if they're not going to use it, if they're in the support tree and they need to not take Rapid Response. So that's worth looking into. Swarm Smiter, increase accuracy by 4 for each alive enemy, stacks up to 16. This is going to be at least 4 every time, can stack up to 16. Hydra heads are always considered alive, so that even a decapitated head gives you 16. So this is 16 extra accuracy in Hydra, 4 extra accuracy in Clan Boss. Overall, this is very good for your debuffers because it's bonus accuracy. It doesn't count in your stats when you're looking at your stats, but it is there and it's worth knowing that you have it. So it's worth picking up. It's a good one. And then finally, Arcane Celerity, which is basically to debuffs what Rapid Response is to buffs. 30% chance of increasing turn meter by 10% when a debuff cast by this champion is removed or expired. This is great for champions that rely on debuffs to do damage for soloing. So your Artex that are doing burns, or some of your Tios that do tons and tons and tons of poisons that eventually start falling off. And as they start falling off, the champion gets turn meter boost. So that's why this is a very good one. This gets taken an awful lot for debuffers. It's a very good ability, and it's one of the reasons that the support tree is actually very powerful. Merciful Aid, another way to increase the healing and shield. It's 15% more healing and shield if your champion is being controlled. So if they're under stun, sleep, freeze, I believe it does affect fear as well. 15% extra shield, 15% extra healing. I don't like this one as much because there's some better ones in this line, but also I don't like counting on the fact that my champions are going to be stunned, sleeped, or frozen. That said, if you're building an arena champion that's supposed to be healing, this can be the difference between somebody staying alive when they're stunned and somebody not staying alive when they're stunned. So there's that. Cycle of Magic, 5% chance of decreasing the cooldown of a random skill by 1 each turn. This is a great ability. This is a tuned team killer because this becomes a random chance to change a skill cooldown. So if you have a team where a champion is supposed to cast a skill at a specific time and it's tuned for that, you cannot have Cycle of Magic. Otherwise, Cycle of Magic is amazing. It's actually good on nukers if you can put it on nukers, for example, because they have a chance of getting 5% cooldown on their nuke. It's useful on revivers. It's useful on healers. It's just useful. And because it doesn't do turn meter, it can be useful on champions in teams that are tuned where that champion is not relied on to get specific attacks or anything out at a specific time. So your damage dealers can generally use Cycle of Magic in a clan boss build pretty reasonably and fairly if you want them to. But you do have to be careful with it and just make sure it doesn't reset something that could cause a problem. If you're building a Hydra team, Cycle Magic is just fine. Cycle Magic also is bad against Amius because this is one of the ones that'll give Amius a free A1 shot that'll kill somebody. And it's really annoying, and I would not redo my Masteries just to fix that. Lore of Steel is one that's got a lot of confusion over it. In a lot of the tunes for Clan Boss, there were a lot of people that were worried that Lore of Steel was breaking their tune. And the reason that Lore of Steel could have a problem with speed tunes is Lore of Steel is 15% additional bonus to sets on your stats. So if you have the 12% speed boost on your stats, instead it becomes 13.5 or something around that. It adds up a little. It's 15% of that 12%. So it's another 1 or 2 points of speed. But it rounds up or it rounds down when it shows you the speed. But the actual speed can be different. And in a team like a clan boss, where the turn meter is super important, 0.2 difference in speed can be enough to throw off a tune over the course of 50 turns. And it's really annoying, it's very frustrating, but that is why Lore of Steel is difficult to use in tuned clan boss teams. And that's why things like Dead to a Jedi's calculator actually has a checkbox for do you have Lore of Steel and what sets you have on your champion. Because the set rounding and Lore of Steel can make a huge, huge difference on whether or not you're going to be in tune or out of tune. Lore of Steel overall is one of the better support masteries that you'll get because it's great with your stone skins. It's great with your supersonics. It's great with your protection sets. It's great with any set that gives you additional stats. It doesn't work with a savage set. It does, however, work with a lethal set, giving you an additional crit rate or two. It can work with anything that gives you additional stats. It does not affect the percent. It does not affect multiplicative other stuff. So it doesn't affect stun chances. It doesn't affect anything else, but it affects the stat bonuses. And yes, it's only a few percentage points here and there as an end result, but it's extra stats. And sometimes the difference between having a 253 speed and a 254 speed can be that mastery, and that difference in speed can be enough to be whether or not you're in tune or out of tune, all kinds of stuff. So Lore of Steel is great. It's just more stats generally good, but you do have to be careful with it, like you have to be careful with some of the other turn meter stuff as well. Finally, Evil Eye, a very common one to take with a lot of debuffers, is the very first hit that a champion does to an enemy will give a turn meter decrease of either 20% for single target or 5% for AoE skills. And random hit skills are counted as single hit skills for purposes of this, so they can do a pretty decent turn meter, even if it's something like Cold Heart's 4-hit random A1. Overall, Evil Eye is a great skill. It does have limited use. It does require accuracy, which was something that I was not aware of without talking to a couple other people, but it does require accuracy. So sometimes it can be resisted. And it means that it's not always great on some champions. Like a Siphi, where you're never going to build with accuracy, Evil Eye is not super great on a Siphi, especially because you're also going to sleep her as well. Plus, Siphi's turn meter drop means that instead of sleeping them, you might put the turn meter drop on and then proceed to heal everybody instead. So Siphi, bad for Evil Eye. Most other champions, Evil Eye is a very useful skill. Finally, here on Tier 5, Lasting Gifts, and there is a similar version of this of Master Hexer. They give you a 30% chance to extend the duration of any buff, or Master Hexer is the extent of a debuff, by 1 turn. Now, they have certain ones they will not extend, specifically the control debuffs, or Lasting Gifts is the buffs of block damage, unkillable, revive on death don't get extended. But otherwise, it is any buff gets extended by 1 turn. There's a couple scenarios where you need to be careful, particularly in clan boss teams, where you might extend the buffs occasionally. You can overbuff and outbuff a team if you have this running on a couple of champions. That's specifically a problem with the Myth Fu. If you have Demitha with Lasting Gifts, she can eventually cast too many of her continuous heals on somebody, and then they won't be able to get the unkillable buff that they need to, or the block damage buff in that case, and that can be a problem. Overall, Lasting Gifts, most champions, very good. You want it for your buffers. It's a great thing. Same with, as I said, Master Hexer, extending any non-control. It also doesn't extend bomb debuffs. That's a nice call out there, because who wants to extend a bomb debuff by 1 turn to make it go off 1 turn later? That doesn't make any sense at all. But this means that like a burn that goes out for 2 turns could be 3 turns as well. This is a lot less problematic to have on a champion, because generally you're not too worried about a poison lasting an extra turn, because all it's going to block is another poison. But it can be, so you do have to be careful with whatever teams you're running it on to make sure the Master Hexer doesn't cause a problem to overload the debuff bar as well. Spirit Haste is a great one for your revivers. 8 additional speed for each dead ally, stacks up to 24. This can also be good for some of your solo champions, because they'll have the food that they're farming with. If they're farming with food, dies around them, and it gives them up to 24 additional speed. That can be very helpful. Revivers, it's also good because it speeds up the revivers as people die, so that's definitely worth looking at. And then finally, Sniper. Sniper is one of the best if you need it. It is 5% chance of placing debuffs, additional chance, I should say, of placing debuffs with skills and artifacts that does not apply to your controls. So it doesn't apply to your stun, sleeps, freeze, or provokes. That's what Fearsome Presence is for. But if you have a 60% chance of placing poisons, it's now a 65%. You have a 50% chance of placing a debuff, it becomes a 55% chance. Stagnite, for example, has a 95% chance of placing a decreased defense and weaken. This makes it a 100% chance. So that's good. Sniper is very useful until it isn't. As long as the base ability is less than 100%, Sniper is great. The moment every ability is at 100%, Sniper becomes useless. Sniper is a great one to take on a lot of champions. Early on, it can actually be helpful if you're struggling to book champions and you need to get that extra 5% here or there. Whether or not it makes sense end game, depending on how you have the champion built, will depend on the champion themselves. Finally, getting down to the final part of the support tier, we're going to look at Elixir of Life, 3000 max HP, nothing to sneeze at, very good. I think 3000 max HP is worth more than 200 defense, but it really will depend on the champion as well, particularly for healers or champions in PvE. HP generally better than defense because there's a lot of ignored defense in PvP. You also have healing that is based off of max HP in a lot of champions, so extra max HP means more healing. That's good. Timely Intervention increases this champion's turn meter by 20% when ally drops below 25 HP. Very, very useful for your revivers again, can be very good in PvP and PvE. Very useful overall. You need to make sure that's on a champion where this is not happening to them, although it will work for them too, but it is happening regularly outside of them, and it's not an issue of the turn meter is going to cause a problem. Obviously, this is not good in Clan Boss, because in Clan Boss, this could actually trigger at times you don't want it to, so got to be careful. Oppressor is probably one of the ones that's underlooked the most. Increase the turn meter fill rate by 2.5% for each active debuff cast by this champion, stacks up to 10%. Basically, this makes a champion up to 10% faster for all the debuffs they have out there. So your poisons champions that are getting out tons of poisons and killing on the waves, this is how they take extra turns. This speeds them up tremendously. The Oppressor is great for your solo champions, can be useful for champions that you want to be constantly taking turns and they're constantly putting debuffs up there. But that's really the only case where this is super, super useful. So not every champion is going to find Oppressor to be super useful. They're more likely to then go with Eagle Eye over here. Eagle Eye gives you plus 50 accuracy. That is great overall, particularly for champions you're going to be using in PvP, where all the accuracy counts all the time. So Eagle Eye can be great if you're struggling to get to accuracy targets in PvP, especially for like some of the champions where you need 600 plus accuracy for that particular dungeon. Great skill, definitely worth picking up as well if you can. So I find that it's pretty common for me to either go down to get one of these bottom support trees, or I end up with War Master, unless it's a very specific build, and then I'll end up with something here in the defense, either resistance or Fearsome Presence or Bulwark. Some of these other ones are worth looking at. For example, I didn't mention I didn't mention Arcane Celerity. Arcane Celerity has this wonderfully fun side effect in Fire Knight Hard. Arcane Celerity in Fire Knight Hard activates when you freeze the boss, and he immediately gets rid of it and takes the turn meter decrease. So this means that your newts that have a 3-time chance to freeze land all 3 debuffs, get 3 freezes out there, and each hit has a 30% chance of increasing their turn meter by 10% because the thing was removed. Very, very useful in Fire Knight. There's all kinds of cool things you can do with a lot of these masteries, and that's why it's worth investing in the masteries. Hopefully you get a chance to understand all of these masteries a little bit better, and hopefully this has given you some opportunity to understand them. This doesn't mean you can't copy a mastery off of hellhades.com or Yumi Love or another resource, but it means that hopefully you can at least understand what these masteries are doing, and you can at least look at a mastery tree and say, that looks okay, or that's wrong, I'm breaking something. And that's very important, particularly for clan boss tuning. and overall for just adding value to your account. So hopefully you can use this information to add value to the account. I realize this has probably been fairly dry content, so appreciate you guys sticking around. Love y'all. Appreciate your support. Till next video, I've been Bront CatHerder.